grand auditorium at Georgetown University Law Center grew completely silent. All eyes turned toward Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who sat upright in her chair on the stage. Though her frame was small and her health had faced challenges in recent years, her presence still commanded the entire room. Her sharp gaze, as piercing as ever, fixed on the podium where Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood. "Justice Ginsburg," Crockett began, her voice echoing through the hall. "With all respect to your legacy, your slow and cautious approach to women's rights has failed us. While you chose to work within the system, countless women continued to suffer. Your much-praised friendship with Justice Scalia is part of what's wrong with our politics today. Compromise with those who attack our basic rights is not justice." A wave of shock swept through the audience. Students exchanged stunned glances. Esteemed professors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Had a sitting congresswoman truly criticized the legendary, notorious RBG right to her face? The 87-year-old justice didn't answer right away. Instead, she calmly removed her glasses and set them on the table in front of her. Her expression was neutral, but those familiar with her noticed the subtle tightening of her jaw, rare sign that Ginsburg was angry. What came next would not only leave the room speechless, but would also reshape how the nation viewed one of the most celebrated justices in American history. But before diving into this unforgettable confrontation that has captured the attention of legal scholars and political commentators across the country, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. This face-off between two powerful women highlights deep truths about justice strategy and the long struggle for equality, insights you won't want to miss. The Georgetown Law Symposium on Women and the Constitution had been designed to honor Justice Ginsburg's remarkable career. For over 60 years, from her early days battling discrimination as a young law student to her groundbreaking work with the ACLU Women's Rights Project, and later her nearly 3 decades on the U.S. Supreme Court, Bader Ginsburg had dismantled legal barriers to gender equality one case at a time. By 87, she had become a cultural icon. Her image appeared on mugs, T-shirts. Her workout routines became books. Her signature dissenting collar became a symbol of resistance. Generations of young women celebrated her as a feminist trailblazer who had transformed the law step by step, building progress through precedent. Yet, not everyone was convinced her cautious approach was still effective in today's divided political climate. Some activists criticized her decision not to retire during the Obama administration, warning it gave conservatives the chance to claim her seat. Others questioned her well-known friendship with Justice Anton Scalia, arguing that it softened the image of those who opposed fundamental rights. Ginsburg rarely addressed such criticisms directly. Throughout her career, she chose her words carefully and avoided political arguments. She believed persuasion, not direct confrontation, was the best path toward lasting change. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett represented the opposite philosophy. At 42, the freshman Democrat from Texas had quickly risen as one of the boldest progressive voices in Washington. A former civil rights attorney who defended Black Lives Matter activists, Crockett never hesitated to call out her opponents. Her fiery speeches on the House floor went viral, earning her a massive online following. She was unapologetic, confrontational, and unwilling to compromise on core principles. The symposium had originally been planned as a bridge between 2 generations of feminism. Ginsburg's careful, strategic fight through the courts, and Crockett's passionate confrontational push for immediate change. Professor Elena Kagan, then still at Georgetown before her Supreme Court appointment, had asked the event to stay focused on strategy, not personal attacks. But as soon as Crockett began her remarks, it was obvious she had no intention of sticking to those rules. This clash was about far more than a disagreement between 2 women. It represented a deeper question. Should social change come gradually through careful legal work or through fearless, uncompromising demands? It raised debates about generational feminism and whether younger activists showed enough respect for those who had fought before them. For Ginsburg, it was her life's philosophy at stake. For Crockett, it was a chance to reject what she saw as outdated compromise with systems of oppression. The packed room of students, faculty, lawmakers, and journalists realized they were witnessing history, a rare public challenge to one of America's most respected justices. What about you? Do you believe progress comes from steady, strategic steps or from bold, direct confrontation? Share your thoughts in the comments about which approach has been most effective in advancing civil rights in U.S. history. At the Georgetown Auditorium, with its polished wood and portraits of legendary jurists, had hosted countless debates, but none like this. Let me make my point clear. Crockett pressed on, sensing the room's unease. Your strategy of reaching across the aisle has only strengthened conservatives, while they've stripped away women's rights piece by piece. Crockett's voice grew sharper as she held up a sheet of paper. Your celebrated friendship with Justice Scalia gave legitimacy to his harmful views, she declared. Here is a list of his votes against women's rights, against LGBTQ rights, against voting rights. These aren't just abstract legal theories. These decisions harmed real people. Yet you still called him your best friend and even attended the opera together. The moderator, a Georgetown law professor who looked visibly uneasy, leaned toward the microphone. Congresswoman, perhaps we can turn to the legal substance. This is the substance. Crockett cut in quickly. When we act as if those who deny our humanity are just colleagues with different viewpoints, we normalize their oppression. Justice Ginsburg's careful step-by-step approach may have worked in the 1970s, but today rights are being stripped away far faster than they are won. She turned back to Ginsburg. And let's be honest, your refusal to step down during President Obama's administration was a political gamble that endangered everything you stood for. You risked the rights of millions because you wouldn't let go of power. Some in the audience flinched. A distinguished female judge sitting in the front row shook her head, visibly disapproving. Still, Crockett pressed on. And then there's Shelby County v. Holder, she continued, her tone fierce. That ruling gutted the Voting Rights Act, and you authored the opinion. The room buzzed with murmurs. Even those sympathetic to Crockett's frustrations recognized her mistake. Justice Ginsburg had in fact written a blistering dissent in that case. Not the majority opinion. You have the wrong justice. Congresswoman, a voice called from the audience. Crockett faltered for only a moment before recovering. My larger point stands. The court has been tearing down civil rights protections while polite collegiality has failed to stop. She fixed her gaze directly on Ginsburg. You once said women belong in every room where decisions are made. I agree. But when those decisions actively harm people, politeness is not a virtue. It is complicity. Incremental change is a luxury women of color and working women simply cannot afford. The tension in the auditorium was overwhelming. Younger law students who had grown up admiring RBG now sat torn between their deep respect for her and sympathy for some of Crockett's arguments. Older lawyers and judges, however, looked appalled, seeing the Congresswoman's words as blatant disrespect toward a legal legend. Through it all, Justice Ginsburg remained motionless. Her expression was calm, her body still. The years she had spent honing self-control, facing prejudice, and fighting battles she was told she could never win were evident in her composure. She didn't flinch, didn't interrupt, didn't show anger. The moderator attempted again. Perhaps we should take questions from the audience. I have one more point, Crockett insisted, refusing to yield. Justice Ginsburg, your dissents may be eloquent, but at the end of the day, they are only dissents. They carry no legal power. They've been turned into slogans and tote bags, but they don't protect anyone. Women need more than beautiful words. We need justices who will not stay polite while rights are under attack. Finally, Crockett stopped. The moderator, clearly relieved, turned to the justice. Justice, would you like to respond to the Congresswoman's comments? The room went silent. Every eye turned toward the small, frail-looking woman sitting upright in her chair. Some expected her to decline politely as she so often had. Others anticipated a short diplomatic answer that would ease the tension without addressing the sharp accusations. But instead, Justice Ginsburg leaned toward her microphone. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the familiar trace of her Brooklyn accent. I would be glad to respond to the Congresswoman's concerns, she said evenly. Debate is the very heart of democracy. She carefully folded her hands on the table, the light catching her famous dissent collar and ring. What we have here is a profound disagreement about how real lasting change happens within a constitutional system. This is not a new debate. It has been part of every struggle for equality. The audience leaned forward, captivated. One of the greatest legal minds of the century was about to defend not just her personal choices, but her entire judicial philosophy. Justice Ginsburg took a sip of water, each movement deliberate, her silence pulling the crowd deeper into attention. When she spoke again, her tone was quiet but commanding, a skill she had mastered years ago while arguing before a bench of men who frequently cut her off. Congresswoman Crockett argues that my approach to advancing women's rights is too slow, too patient, too willing to compromise. She points to my friendship with Justice Scalia as proof of weakness rather than strength, as if respect and civility erase principle. At that moment, she reached for a slim folder from the table beside her, something no one had noticed until now. If I may, she said, let me begin with a brief history lesson. When I first began challenging gender discrimination in the 1970s, Justice Ginsburg said softly, opening a folder of notes, The law was stacked firmly against women. A woman could legally be fired simply for being pregnant. Banks were free to deny credit cards to unmarried women. Public universities could openly reject applicants because of their gender. And in most states, marital rape was not considered a crime. She glanced toward Crockett, her gaze steady. I chose to fight that system step by step, case by case. Not because I lacked courage or conviction, but because I understood how precedent shapes our law. Every victory becomes the foundation for the next. Looking directly at the Congresswoman, her voice gained strength. You describe these as small or timid steps. Let me remind you of Sally Reed, a mother denied the right to administer her son's estate simply because she was a woman. Or Sharon Frontiero, a lieutenant in the Air Force, denied the same housing benefits as her male colleagues. Or Stephen Wessenfeld, a widowed father, denied survivor benefits he needed to care for his infant child. These were not abstract theories, Congresswoman. They were real people with real struggles. She turned another page. When I represented Sharon Frontiero before the Supreme Court, the bench was made up entirely of men. I could have condemned them as part of a patriarchal system, but instead I persuaded them by showing how gender discrimination harms everyone, including men. I made them see their own daughters' futures in the case before them. For the first time, emotion crept into her voice. That was not weakness. That was strategy. I was playing the long game at a time when the odds were against us. A few heads in the audience nodded, some visibly reconsidering their initial sympathy for Crockett's critique. Ginsburg's calm but pointed defense was resonating. You also suggest my friendship with Justice Scalia was a betrayal of principle, she continued. Allow me to tell you what that friendship achieved. She lifted another document from her folder. This is an early draft of Justice Scalia's opinion in United States v. Virginia, the case that opened the Virginia Military Institute to women. His draft contained language that would have dramatically limited the scope of the decision. Through our conversations as friends who respected one another despite deep disagreement, that restrictive language was removed. She raised her eyes from the page. He didn't change his vote. He never abandoned his philosophy. But because of that dialogue, women's rights were safeguarded in ways that will last for generations. Would you call that surrender? I call it effective advocacy. At the podium, Crockett shifted slightly, her earlier confidence tempered by the precision of Ginsburg's rebuttal. As for my dissents, Ginsburg said evenly, you dismiss them as symbolic gestures. But that misunderstands their role. A dissent does three things. It forces the majority to sharpen its reasoning. It creates a blueprint for future lawyers, and most importantly, it speaks to future generations. She removed her glasses and looked directly at Crockett, no barrier between them. When I wrote in Shelby County that throwing out pre-Clance was like tossing away your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm simply because you weren't getting wet, I wasn't writing for tote bags. I was laying down a legal principle that civil rights advocates are using in courts across America today to fight restrictive voting laws. Several law professors in the audience nodded in recognition. One whispered to another, she's right. We cite that dissent in every single voting rights case. You also raised my decision not to retire during the Obama years. Ginsburg continued, her tone factual. I made that decision based on my health and my ability to serve at the time. No one can foresee the future with certainty. Each of us makes decisions with the knowledge we have in that moment. I truly believed I could continue contributing on the bench. She tapped her papers into a neat stack, then leaned slightly forward, her intensity sharpening. But let us not reduce advocacy to two extremes, passive politeness or fiery confrontation. That is a false choice. Change in a democracy has always required multiple strategies working side by side. While I was building precedents one case at a time, others were marching in the streets. While I persuaded conservative judges with reasoning they could accept, others pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible. These strategies don't cancel one another, they strengthen each other. In the front row, a young law student scribbled furiously in a notebook, clearly recognizing this as a rare window into Ginsburg's deeper philosophy. You say my incremental approach was born of timidity, she finished firmly. But it was, in fact, deliberate, was a strategy shaped by an understanding of how our legal system operates. The precedents I helped establish, precedents that for the first time recognize gender discrimination as unconstitutional, are the very foundation that today's advocates now stand upon. She carefully closed the folder and placed both hands gently on top of it. She recalled a famous saying often credited to Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Yet, she explained, people often forget that this bend doesn't happen on its own. Progress takes effort. It requires individuals to pull it in that direction, some working inside institutions to reshape them from within and others applying pressure from the outside to accelerate change. At this moment, Ginsburg's voice shifted into a tone of calm instruction, similar to a professor guiding an eager but inexperienced student. "You describe my approach as if it failed simply because the same struggles remain," she said. "But that reflects a misunderstanding of how progress actually unfolds. Social change is not a straight line. It rises and falls in waves with victories and setbacks." She motioned toward the portraits of legal pioneers displayed across the auditorium's walls. Thud Marshall's carefully planned litigation strategy didn't fail just because racism persists. Susan B. Anoni's lifelong activism wasn't wasted because women still face bias. The fact that these battles continue doesn't invalidate earlier. Progressive proves how hard the work is and how many generations must persist to keep advancing it. Her features softened slightly as she addressed another point. "The merchandise with my face, which you dismiss as mere performance, has given countless young women the courage to imagine themselves as lawyers, judges, and even justices. Symbols matter. Representation matters. Inspiration matters." She straightened her posture even more, her presence commanding the room. "And as for your critique of my majority opinions compared to my dissents, I would encourage you to study them more closely. In United States v. Virginia, I wrote for the majority that any gender-based classification must meet an exceedingly persuasive justification, closest standard to strict scrutiny this court has ever used for gender cases. That decision continues to safeguard women's rights today." With her hands folded again, she continued in an even steadier voice. "Congresswoman, I have spent my entire professional life fighting for equality. I have done so with strategy, with persistence, and with a realistic understanding of how institutions evolve. You may choose a different path, and that is your right. But understand this, movements need many kinds of warriors. And do not mistake my deliberate approach for weakness. Do not confuse civility with surrender. Some of us select our battles with care not out of fear, but because we know that real lasting change requires both bold vision and patient planning. It requires righteous passion alongside persuasive strategy, urgent demands alongside precise legal argument." Her voice grew softer, yet every word carried through the silent auditorium. "I respect your passion. I too grow impatient with the slow pace of justice. But wisdom lies in knowing when to confront and when to persuade, when to demand and when to negotiate, when to speak with fire and when to speak in a way your opponent can truly hear." The silence that followed was complete. Congresswoman Crockett stood frozen at the podium, visibly shaken by the depth and precision of Ginsburg's words. The response was not a dismissal, a full masterclass in strategy from one of the greatest legal minds of her time. The audience, too, seemed stunned, reflecting on what they had just witnessed. The moderator, searching for words, finally broke the quiet. "Thank you, Justice Ginsburg. Congresswoman, would you like to reply?" Crockett glanced at her notes, back at the formidable figure who had dismantled her critique with calm precision, never once raising her voice. At last, she spoke. "I appreciate Justice Ginsburg's perspective. I think we all have much to reflect on." As she returned to her seat, the tension gave way to recognition. Everyone in the hall understood that this moment was extraordinary. Not merely a defense of one person's career, a profound reflection on how justice is truly won in a democracy. Within hours, clips of Ginsburg's response spread like wildfire across social media. Hashtags such as strategic advocacy and YRBG Masterclass dominated national trends. News outlets and legal blogs rushed to cover the exchange. Scott's blog described it as a rare glimpse into Ginsburg's legal philosophy and her approach to institutional change. The New York Times framed it as a generational debate about strategy in the fight for equality, highlighting the deeper questions it raised about democracy itself. Cable networks convened legal experts to analyze every line of her response. On CNN, legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin observed, "We saw was not Justice Ginsburg defending her legacy. She was defending a vision of change, one rooted in persuasion and precedent, not only protest." On SMBC, a panel of women's rights attorneys from different generations echoed this view. One former ACLU lawyer who had worked with Ginsburg in the 1970s summed it up. She never compromised on the goal of full equality. She simply understood that achieving it required patience, precision, and persistence. She had always been deliberate about the steps she took to reach her goals. Across law schools nationwide, professors quickly began weaving the viral exchange into their classroom lessons. At Harvard Law, students crammed into an auditorium for a spontaneous discussion on the art of advocacy. At Howard University School of Law, a civil rights professor presented the clip as a case study contrasting different methods of creating institutional change for Congresswoman Crockett. However, the aftermath was far more complex. Her social media feeds lit up with thousands of responses, some sharply critical, others offering thoughtful engagement with her arguments. At first, she released a short statement acknowledging her respect for Justice Ginsburg's historic legacy, while still stressing that modern times might require fresh approaches. 3 days later, she published a longer reflection in The Atlantic. My exchange with Justice Ginsburg has forced me to think more deeply about how different kinds of advocacy work together, she wrote. I still believe we need fearless, uncompromising voices calling for immediate change. But I now have a deeper appreciation for the strategic legal groundwork that makes such demands possible. The most powerful reactions came not from politicians or media outlets, but from young attorneys and activists. Many of them had long felt torn between Ginsburg's careful incremental approach and Crockett's fiery calls for direct confrontation. On blogs and social media, they debated how real progress is achieved through patient institution building or through disruptive demands for justice. Maybe the truth is that we need both. One young public defender wrote in a widely shared post, "We need the RBGs laying down legal precedents, and we need the activists in the streets pushing for faster change. These aren't competing strategies, they are complementary ones." 1 week after the symposium, Justice Ginsburg joined NPR's Nina Totenberg for an interview. Asked about the public confrontation, she replied calmly, "The Congresswoman raised important questions that deserve reflection. Each generation must discover its own path in the fight for equality. My generation laid certain foundations, but it is up to the next generation to decide how to build on them." When pressed about whether she felt offended by such direct criticism, Ginsburg smiled. "In my career, I was told I didn't belong in law school because I was taking a man's seat. I was denied clerkships despite being at the top of my class. I was paid less than male colleagues doing the same work. Compared to those experiences, respectful criticism of my judicial philosophy is hardly something that troubles me." The ripple effects extended far beyond the viral moment. Law schools began reporting heightened student interest in courses about civil rights litigation and strategic advocacy. Georgetown Law even launched an annual lecture series called Multiple Paths to Justice, inviting advocates from diverse backgrounds to share how they pursued social change. 6 months later, Justice Ginsburg announced her retirement due to health concerns. In her statement, she directly referenced the Georgetown Exchange. The discussion about how best to advance equality must never stop. Each generation builds upon the work of those before them, sometimes by continuing the same journey, sometimes by forging a new one. At her final public appearance before stepping down, she was asked what advice she would give to young activists frustrated by slow progress. Her words seemed aimed not just at them, but at Congresswoman Crockett as well. Fight for the things you care about, but do so in ways that bring others with you. Understand that meaningful change is rarely immediate. Be strategic, be patient, and remember, sometimes the most revolutionary act is not tearing down institutions, but reshaping them from within. 3 years later, Congresswoman Crockett carried forward that lesson when she introduced a bill to expand voting rights protections. During the floor debate, she directly invoked Justice Ginsburg's famous dissent in Shelby County v. Holder, quoting the justice's warning about throwing away umbrellas in the middle of a rainstorm. When the bill passed with bipartisan support, Crockett acknowledged that it rested on the legal foundation laid by Ginsburg and earlier civil rights champions, who proved that real progress requires both vision and careful strategy. The Georgetown Law Symposium became far more than a viral debate between two influential women with different tactics. It evolved into a case study of how social movements grow, how varied approaches strengthen one another, and how dialogue across generations, even when tense, can ultimately deepen the fight for justice. As one constitutional scholar summarized, the Ginsburg-Crockett exchange was never about one side being right and the other wrong. It was about recognizing that the path to justice always requires both architects who patiently build, brick by brick, and visionaries who demand we move faster. Tension between them is not weakness. It is the engine of progress itself. Thank you for watching our full analysis of this historic conversation between Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. If you found this breakdown meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth legal and political analysis. Share it with others who care about equality, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe change happens more effectively through patient strategy, bold confrontation, or both working together? Your perspective helps keep this vital conversation alive.